Wonderful. Well, before we jump into the content, I do want to welcome you guys to today's session, Developing Your Theory of Change and Logic Model in partnership with BACP and Greater Arbor and Gresham. Such an honor to facilitate today's session. Since we have an intimate group, let's begin with maybe introductions in a bit. But just to give you an idea of what today's conversation will be centered on, we'll do welcome introductions for around a minute each, and then I'll walk you through the objectives. We'll go through the presentation, and since it's not a webinar for today, I'll glide. I'll try to go fast through the content so I can answer a lot of your questions with the remaining time that we have. So it's a little bit more interactive than a webinar. And then, yeah, just key takeaways. I'll walk you through theory of change best practices. I'll give you theory of change examples, logic model best practices, and examples, and then key takeaways. So I'm happy to kick off the introductions. A little bit about myself. I'm the founder and CEO of Morales Consulting. We're a national firm that specializes in strategic planning, racial equity facilitation, grant making, program design, and evaluation, very relevant to today's conversation, capacity building, also relevant, and project management. And I've worked across the nonprofit, policy, and philanthropic sector, so I have a good pulse to the social sector at large. To give you an idea of some current and past clients, they include Chicago Latinos in Philanthropy here locally, the MBA Foundation based in New York, Valley of the Sun United Way based in Arizona, Philanthropy for a Racially Equitable Greater Chicago, Lawyers Trust Fund of Illinois, Chicago Scholars, another Chicago entity, Railroad Tracks Music Academy, Platform of Hope, LWC Studios in Maryland, and a few more, to give you an idea of the depth of the work that I've done over the past few years. To learn more about my practice, you can visit the website or shoot me an email at moralesconsultingllc.com. And then just more personally about me, I was born in Chicago on the Southwest Side, proud Southsider through and through. Go Sox, although we don't want to start violence this morning between the rivalries across the city of Chicago, but so proud to be from the South Side of Chicago. I studied at Georgetown for undergrad and received my Master's of Public Affairs from Brown. And in my personal board involvement includes being the co-chair of Nuestro Futuro at the Chicago Community Trust. So Nuestro Futuro is the largest affinity fund across the country dedicated to grant making to the Latino community here locally in Chicago. Just yesterday, actually, we had our annual grant making meeting where we funded immigration and early childhood initiatives across the Chicagoland region. And then I'm also on the Albert Hick Jr. Fund Board of Directors, and they're focused on arts, civics, health. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. Maybe I'll kick it off to Dawn, since I see you first on my screen, if you don't mind sharing with the group a little bit about your background and what drove you to attend today's session.
Sure. I'm Dawn Vanderveer. I am the executive director of Childhood Fractured, which is a non-for-profit fostering awareness in child sexual abuse prevention and awareness. Actually, this is my my husband's group. What started off as an art project for him doing live narrative paintings and going over his experience as a survivor just kind of morphed into creating a non-for-profit. What drove me here today is, well, I mean, of course, because of COVID, during the time of lockdown and everything else that has been happening, we've lost a lot of our membership, a lot of our donors, a lot of our patrons. And so we've survived it. And so now, like, things are morphing where the demographic of our group is, instead of focusing more specifically on children, we're actually focusing more on survivors. And also we've got, so we're actually collaborating with another art group called I'm Not Art. They specialize in an NFT art that my husband just joined. And so with this merge, there's going to be a lot of changes within my organization.
That's so wonderful, and congratulations on all the momentum and the amazing experience you bring to the organizations. And we'll definitely talk about why the theory of change and logic model is so critical as your evolution continues, right? Because you want to continue focusing where you should as you think about the merger, right? So wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. Adrian, I see you next on my screen. Do you mind introducing yourself to the group?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying to get onto my laptop right now, but I can without the. I'm sorry, I can't show my face yet because I'm trying to get onto my laptop. Okay, so my name is Adrian McHugh. I
can't do that if I put you out of business on a technicality when you're smaller. So understand, in terms of.
I'm sorry. Somebody talking?
Oh,
Okay.
It seems like it's coming from your end,
Maybe
Adrian.
that was me. I'm sorry. I just realized my computer. I turned it on and I think my computer started. Sorry about that.
Oh, you're
So
good.
my name is Adrian McHugh. I'm from Step Up for Mental Health. We're a small and mighty nonprofit in Chicago. We help all 77 neighborhoods, but most importantly, I mean, we also help families dealing with mental health related issues, including poverty, in all 50 states, basically. But for the most part, we do a lot of support on South Side and West Side of Chicago. And my background, I guess, is because I'm a peer. I had a couple of family members who have mental issues, and my goal is to help other families, particular families of color, uh, uh, be more open to talking about mental health. That's my big thing, but also go Cubs, just saying. Go Cubs, just saying. I do like the Sox. I mean, it's no rival about the Sox. I mean, I would support them if they won, but come on. I'm from the South Side of Chicago. I'm actually from Gresham. I was born and raised in Gresham, all the way till I was 23. Now I live in Humboldt Park, and I'm just here to kind of learn more stuff and with all the new partnerships that I have, and seeing what the conversation was about.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Adrian. And remind me, I feel like you and I have met through an AMPed workshop. Is that correct?
I think I went to one of the workshops.
Did you attend the Mission and Vision workshop that I led with them?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I'm gonna come on and then I can show you. Maybe you can see if I did or not. I could just probably be missing something.
No worries at all. You just seem very familiar. Thanks for being here and
Thank
for that
you.
introduction. Rosa, do you mind introducing yourself to the group, please?
Good morning. I'm Rosa Zamora, Chief of Partnership Development for New Root Learning Institute. We were formerly known as Umoja. So we've been around for quite some time, 25 years today. This year is our 25th anniversary. And we were recently part of UChicago's Ignite program. And in that program, we talked about our theory of change. And so we came up with like a rough version of what it could possibly look like for us. And I guess I'm just like looking for either some validation and feedback in this session, just to get a better sense if we're on the right track, and doing some refining for us as well.
Wonderful. That's so great. Rosa, I used to work at McCormick Foundation, and we were a huge funder and supporter of Umoja. So it's great to see you here.
Yes, thank you so much.
Great. Adrian, I think that's your other phone, right?
Yes, I'm about to come.
Okay, great. Just wanted to confirm. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here. I hope that you've been able to hear a little bit more about your peers and what motivates them to be here and their awesome backgrounds that they bring. And hopefully this can be a resource and peer network as you move forward. So please do stay in touch with one another. Since you're all interested in theory of change, it could be a good cohort to maybe potentially stay in touch with. Have someone to look at your logic model, your theories of change, since everybody's committed to that. So maybe before we drop off at the end, let's all share, or maybe throughout the presentation, if you guys don't mind, add in your emails, your websites, your LinkedIn, so you guys can all stay in touch with each other and then leverage each other as a resource, because obviously we're all here to improve our theory of change and logic model. So it'd be really helpful if you all stayed in touch with each other and build this awesome community. Great. Well, let's jump into the exciting content for today. So I have three objectives for today's conversation. The first one is to understand the key components, of course, of a theory of change and logic model. By the end of this session, participants will be able to identify and describe the essential elements that make up a theory of change and logic model, and also key differences. They're often interchangeably used, and they're really distinct, and we're going to talk about what makes them distinct. So we'll go through the essential elements that make up a theory of change and logic model, including the inputs, resources, activities, interventions, outcomes, and impact. And then hopefully you'll have a clear understanding of how these components relate to each other in the context of program planning, evolution, and evaluation. Secondly, you'll learn how to create a logic model and theory of change. So you'll gain actual practical knowledge on best practices for the logic model and the programs and projects necessary to bring that to life. You'll learn how to effectively represent the logical relationships between program inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes in a visual format to hopefully help you drive stronger impact for your organization, and hopefully align to your theory of change. So you'll use it as a framework to complement your theory of change through your logic model, and hopefully communicate that program's intended outcomes really succinctly, clearly, concretely to your external audiences. And then thirdly, apply any concepts to practical examples and case studies. So we'll go through a few examples. We'll go through videos to kind of bring this to life a little bit more concretely. And yeah, just bring you real world scenarios and really apply the insights and the tools and how they've been used in different projects, and how it's also show you that it's adaptive. There's not really like a copy paste. Everybody brings their own sauce and special juice to like these. So the most important takeaway is that I want you to have the essential framework, and then there's iteration that you can use throughout each of your own theory of change and logic models, as long as you have the core components. So don't feel pressured that it has to be the one perfect template. That doesn't exist. There are best practices that we'll walk through, and as long as you have those best practices, feel free to always adapt based on your need. So those are our three goals today. So let's start with, what is a theory of change? A theory of change is essentially a comprehensive description and illustration of how and why a desired change is expected to happen in a particular context, i.e., your program mission. It's focused on a particular mapping out or filling in what has been described as a missing middle between what a program or change initiative does. So think about who you're serving. So it's key activities, interventions, whether you're doing outreach to families, tutoring, and then the how these lead to desired goals and outcomes achieved. So it's the missing middle between those. And it does this by first identifying the desired long-term goals, and then you work backwards from there. And then you identify the conditions, the outcomes that must be in place, and how these relate to one another causally for the goals to occur. And these are all mapped out in the outcomes framework that we'll talk about. And then the outcomes framework then provides that basis for identifying what type of activity or intervention will lead to the outcome identified as preconditions for achieving that long-term goal. So through this approach, the precise link between activities and the achievement of the long-term goals are more fully understood, right? We're kind of providing a link to that missing middle that brings it all together, right? From program inputs and initiatives all the way to outcomes. We're going to close the loop on that missing middle, so you as a staff understand why you're focusing on a specific initiative and what your hopeful intended outcomes long-term and short-term and midterm should be based on those indicators. And ultimately, this leads to better planning and the activities that are linked that detail the understanding of how change actually happens. So as Don mentioned, they're about to go through this this change and evolution in the organization. So by identifying that missing middle and being very clear about your inputs, your program activities, all the way to short-term, midterm, and the long-term, and the in-between, you close the loop and become precise as these external factors move around you. You stay tunnel vision or adapt based on those external environments. Maybe it's an opportunity to refresh, and it sounds like it is, but still focused on like your long-term goal. What is it that you're trying to achieve? And that's what we'll talk about today. And then ultimately, better evaluation. You understand, am I having the correct and the intended and the most impactful impact that my organization can have given our limited capacities and resources? Because we all know we're resource constrained in our budgets and our staff and our time. So we also want to be as efficient and focused, and the logic model and theory of change allow us to really tactfully say, this is where we should be focusing on. And anything beyond that is a no. So hopefully out of your theory of change and logic model, no becomes very comfortable with you, because you have your clear marching orders of where you will be focusing. You're clearly focused on your North Star goals, and anything beyond that is not a primary focus of your strategy and your theory of change for your program. So you know when a potential partnership or your board recommends an initiative that's not aligned to a strategic plan, specifically your theory of change, you can then reference those theory of change, those logic models, and say, you know what, that's a great idea. Unfortunately, based on our strategic plan, based on our theory of change that we've co-developed as a staff and as a board, we don't believe that initiative is aligned to our current theory of change based on these short-term, midterm, and long-term outcomes. So ultimately, it empowers you to stay focused and say no to all your important stakeholders that inevitably are loud voices in the room, your donors potentially, who we know you get pulled in so many directions, right? All the time. I mean, we can talk about this for hours about how all these amazing ideas bubble up and sometimes are worth consideration. And as long as you have these grounding documents to say, okay, well, before we say yes, let's revisit our theory of change. Let's revisit our logic model. That's what we want to get into the practice of. And we'll get into like how often should you revisit it? What's a good approach to revisit your logic model? So we'll talk about that. So it doesn't just become something that you sit on the shelf and gather dust. But really, we hope that you get into a good rhythm of reviewing at least quarterly and refreshing and monitoring toward your progress on these goals. So yeah, let's get into it. And then, as I mentioned, the theory of change also requires participants to be very clear on the long-term goals. I can't emphasize that enough. The long term, what is it you're trying to achieve in the long term? And the long term can be defined in whatever time parameters you want. But we'll talk about some best practices of how we think about the short term, the midterm, and then the long-term goals, and how you should be outlining those. And then it should also identify measurable indicators of success. So it has to be very concrete. Your mission and vision are a little bit more loose. This is what activates concretely that mission and vision, right? So when you're saying you want to impact students, you want to say how many students you want to impact. That, like, as an example, right? So you want to be very concrete about those long-term and short-term and midterm goals, and where you're shooting. And it's also a very distinct way. The theory of change is a very distinct way of describing your impact. It shows a casual pathway from here to there, so A to Z, and specify what's needed for the goals to achieve, right? So you clearly outline the blueprint that you're going to take in order to achieve your impact, which is ultimately, I found in developing logic models with partners, clients, is that it actually makes their storytelling a lot more precise and crisp. Their elevator pitch gets so good. It's so exciting to see that once they develop the logic model and theory of change, because they outline their strategies, and then they talk about how they're going to achieve those outcomes based off those strategies. So it actually unintentionally and intentionally becomes a communications tool for your staff, your program staff, your development staff, your ED, and even your board, if you socialize it with them enough, for them to have a quick elevator pitch that precisely captures your program's intended impact. Because oftentimes we have so many robust programs, we have so many robust strategies that we become overwhelmed and often don't know how to articulate those. This is kind of like that brain dump, and then thinking about the long-term impact. And then because you write it down, because you have a clear linear and sequential way to see it, it ultimately allows you to describe it more meaningfully. So it's exciting for that reason as well, besides the monitoring and evaluation components that of course are very necessary to improve the program's impact. And it also requires you to articulate underlying assumptions, which can be tested and also measured. And it changes the way of thinking about initiatives from what you're doing to what you want to achieve. And it starts there, right? So instead of just saying, oh, this is what we're doing, and that's it, it's that missing middle that's kind of like closed. It's what do you want to achieve? Again, going back to the real importance on outcomes and long-term outcomes and fleshing those out and being very, very concrete about that. So a theory of change typically consists of 4 key components. There's the inputs, there's the activities and interventions, the outcomes, and then the impact. So the inputs and resources are both, the first one related to inputs and resources are both tangible and intangible and required to implement your program effectively. So we'll talk about that. And then your activities and interventions are specific actions that your program will take to bring about that change. And then the outcomes are, as I mentioned, the short term, the medium and long-term changes that your program intends to achieve. And then the impact. What is the ultimate desired change or effect that your program aims to have on individuals, communities, and systems? So again, the theory of change is like just these, as long as you have these 4, you are covered really strongly. And again, if you Google, I think a lot of my clients often get overwhelmed because they see so many different moving parts with the theory of change and they all look so different. And ultimately, don't let that overwhelm you. As long as you have these 4 key components, you're good. And of course, adapt iterate based on your preference, but please at least include these in your theory of change. So how do you begin kind of scoping out the theory of change then? So the theory of change process hinges upon defining all of the necessary and sufficient conditions required to bring about a given long-term outcome. So theory of change uses backward mapping. As I mentioned, you always start with the end in mind, the North Star goal. So that's what I mean by backward mapping. So it's not the beginning of the program or identifying the initiatives. It's actually the reverse. You start with the ultimate end goal in mind when developing your theory of change. So you use backward mapping that's requiring planning to think it in backward steps from the long-term goal to the intermediate or medium-term goal, and then the early-term goals and changes that would be required to cause that desired change. So this creates a set of connected outcomes, right? That middle, known as that pathway for change. And that pathway for change graphically represents the change process as it is understood by the initiative planners and the skeleton around the other elements of the theory of change that are developed. So during the process of creating the pathway of change, participants are required to articulate as many of their assumptions about the change process as they can, so they can be examined and even be tested to determine if any key assumptions are hard to support or even false, right? So you want to document your assumptions that you're taking to then ultimately test those assumptions. And we'll get more into that. So don't worry, we're going to talk about what we mean by documenting assumptions and whether they're kind of hard to support or even false, right? Was I taking the wrong assumption? Was I making the wrong hypothesis about this program? So you ultimately test like what your assumptions are leading to that long-term outcome that you're hoping to achieve. So ultimately, I want you to understand the assumptions that are critical to consider. And there's usually three that are really important when thinking about how to factor in assumptions. So one, assertions about the connections between long-term, intermediate, and early outcomes on the map. So you want to make assertions about those connections between the long-term, intermediate, and early outcomes of a map. So what are the assumptions that you're building that will get you from early outcome to midterm outcome to long-term outcome? Why do you believe that if you go from A to B to Z, that you will continue to grow? So what are the assertions about the connections that you're making between those long-term, medium-term, and early goals? The second is substantiation for the claim that all of the important preconditions for success have been identified. And that's really important as well, because you want to substantiate the claims that you're making about all the essential preconditions for your success and how you've identified those. And then the third ultimately is the justification for supporting the links between program activities, which are really important. So what assumptions are you making between those program activities that will drive the outcome that they're expected to produce? Why do you believe that? Why do you believe if you invest in tutoring for math, that they will improve their math ACT score? What are your assumptions? So ultimately, you want to justify those links in the way that you're focusing your strategy and the linkage between the outcomes that they're expected to produce. And then ultimately, a fourth kind of assumption is outlining the contextual / environmental factors that will support or hinder progress toward the realization and outcomes in the pathways of change is often like something that you want to consider. So Dawn is a really great example of this. So an external factor for Dawn right now is this evolution merger, if I understood this correctly, of her arts organization. That is an external factor that you want to outline and document your assumptions of how that merger is going to influence your long-term outcomes, or identify the risk mitigation, right? Because it's both. What are the risks? And then what are the assumptions that you took a choice to merge with this group because you believe that it will lead to higher outcomes, right? What are those assumptions based off in those external factors? So you want to document that. So ultimately, that theory of change approach to planning is designed to encourage very clear and specific outcomes at every stage of the process, of the change process. So, and I can't say that enough, you want to be concrete. This is not the time to be amorphous and visionary. It is both, but attach concreteness, specificity to your ambition. And then you're required to specify a number of details about the nature of the desired change. So that specificity can be about the target population, the amount of change required to signal success to you. Is it the student served? Is it a specific change outcome? And then ultimately the time frame, the time-bound parameters of which that change will occur. So you want to be very specific about what is the time frame. Are we talking about 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? But you have to kind of be specific about those time-bound activities. And then ultimately, by you being so attentive and specific to detail in this way, it signals to funders and to external partners, donors, the feasibility of reaching those goals that might have been vaguely defined. And then ultimately, it helps your organization expect accountability. So not only do you hold yourself accountable, but you signal to other partners that you're very committed to your mission because you've outlined very specific metrics that you're hoping to achieve. So we often hear accountability used as a negative term, but ultimately accountability is good if it's driven by you as the organization in the way that you want to have the impact, in the way that you've documented your assumptions, and then in the way that you've outlined your long-term goals. So it actually has the ability to transform your organization to be higher impact by being super concrete. And that's a win-win for funders because they'll be excited. They'll see you have a really well-developed strategy, that you know how you're going to get there. You've clearly defined it. So it actually, if you guys have applied for foundation grants, they often ask for your logic model or theory of change. Has anybody been asked for those yet in grant submissions? Well, if you haven't, I guarantee you will. So it's a good preparation for those grant applications as well. So any questions? I know I just threw a lot your way. We can jump in with questions because this is not your traditional webinar. So before I move on to the remaining part of the content, any questions yet?
I do have this like more of a curiosity question. When we're talking about basic assumptions, are we talking about like basic assumptions about like what we, based on our experience, what we think the activities should be in order to yield the impact, or are we talking about something slightly different?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So again, so when you think about assumptions, you want to think about what are the what is your claim based off, and
Mm,
and
mhm.
like basing those connections between the long term, midterm, and short term. What are your assumptions that you're baking in to say, if we do this, we'll get from short term to long term to sorry, to short term, midterm to long term? What are you what's your, you can't just say that in 3 years we're going to go from here to here to here without explaining it, right? So you have to explain it and why you think, what are your assumptions about why you're going to do that. So you have to justify the supporting links between, yes, not only the long-term outcomes and the outcomes in general, but then what are your justifications supporting the links between your program activities all the way in the beginnings, all the way to outcomes, and why they're expected to produce that change.
That makes sense. So, like, for example, you might like change people's mindsets first, and then you see behavior change or something like that. So, like, the short term would be mindset change, and then the midterm might be like changes in their behaviors, and then the long term would be, changes in more of their life or lifestyle or something like that. Am I following?
Exactly, I think you just outlined very excellent examples of like potential like short-term, midterm, and long-term goals. So you've identified the goals. So now you want to unpack your assumptions of how they're going to go from mind shift changes to behavior change to life outcomes change. Like, what are your assumptions based off, if you do those, why will they lead to the other one? Does that make sense? It's the
Yes,
why.
that's super helpful.
It's
Thank you
the
so much.
it's the why. It's like the documenting of your assumptions of the why. If we change their behavior, why will it go? Or if we change their mind shift, like why will it go to behavior change? What's the research supporting that? You know what I mean? Oh yes, I see your raised hand, Adrian. Please jump in.
Okay. No, I'm just want to clarify something, because one of the things that we often struggle with, we have like 4 programs. I don't know why we started with 4 programs. And so one of my things I'm always thinking about is, are the programs doing exactly what we wanted it to do? And is one of the programs working, for example? And if it's working or isn't, if it's not working, when should we think about maybe removing that program or expanding that program? And could you use the theory of change in this assessment, trying to figure out
Oh
what's
my
the
gosh,
next goal?
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. The theory of change logic model is exactly that. It isn't
Okay.
meant to track progress and monitor evaluation of those program activities. So yeah, we'll get into that in the presentation. So we have a few more slides. So maybe Dawn, I think I saw you go off mute. Do you have a question before I move on to the presentation?
I'm just, oh, wait, I just wondering, are we going to have a copy of the presentation?
Oh yeah, of course. I'm happy to
Okay, thank
share it.
you so
Yes,
much.
absolutely. I'm happy to share with all of you. Of course.
Okay. And also, I mean, I just want to make sure that I'm also thinking of this correctly, because I actually used to work for an insurance company as a QA product tester. And I just remember, like, based on this, it kind of reminds me of, I'm testing um like a glitch in the system, and anything that IT did to supposedly fix it, and then we test it to see if it actually created the desired effect. I mean, am I thinking about this correctly?
That's exactly right. That's a really great analogy. Thank you for that. Absolutely. That's exactly what you want to do. So, and just to summarize, so you go from identifying the long-term goals, you backward map, you connect the preconditions, the assumptions to achieve those goals, and then you identify those interventions that your initiative will perform to create the desired change. So the how, You develop indicators to measure outcomes to assess the performance of your initiative. So Don, Adrian, that's the is it working? So those indicators will tell you, am I achieving those outcomes? So that's the how of you, how you will assess whether or not you're having the intended impact or the highest impact that you want to achieve. And then you can write ultimately a narrative to explain your logic model to external audiences, as I mentioned. It's a really powerful tool. So I see we only have 15 minutes and we still have a few more slides to go through. So I'm gonna kind of pick up the pace because I do want to leave you with as much information as possible, if that's okay. So often I get a question of like, how do you identify indicators that are strong for the theory of change and logic model? So the indicator stage development is when details are added to your change framework in the theory of change. And this stage focuses on how to measure the implementation and effectiveness of the initiative. So Adrian, you set us up really nicely for this segue with your question. And by collecting data on each outcome, the initiative can identify what is or isn't happening and find out why, right? So this is so important. This is why, is it working or it's the pressure test of the program and initiative. So ultimately, each indicator has 4 parts: population, target, threshold, and time. Who is changing? How many do we expect will succeed? How much is good enough? And by when does this outcome need to happen? And all of these are so important, right? So an indicator is the actual variable being measured, such as an average test score or proficiency in a particular skill. The population is the group that you're measuring, such as a program's clients, the students, the parents. So the indicator is what is being measured out of that population, if that makes sense. So what change are you measuring from that population? And then the threshold represents the minimum for the outcome to be successful. So what is a good threshold? That's for you to set, right? Because that's the accountability for yourself to say, if we do this, we know this is working. So Adrian, this is really important. The threshold, so for example, in Chicago, we just saw that the most important threshold for a successful election between 2 mayors was to get 51% of the vote. That's when we know it was a successful election with the leading candidate. We didn't have that in the first one because we had so many candidates in a slate. So we didn't have that minimum threshold for us to say we have success, meaning we have a mayor. We did not achieve success the first election round because that minimum threshold was 51%. So we know, well, it's also legally, right? You legally can't, but so like in tactful terms, right? So we have to go through another runoff to hit the minimum threshold with 2 candidates until one of them gets 51% of the vote, which Mayor Brandon Johnson ultimately got in the runoff. So that we know we're successful in the election for mayor of Chicago because our minimum threshold was validated because we now have a mayor. So I hope that's a relevant example that just happened in the city of Chicago to kind of drive the point home of like, what do we mean by threshold? Well, you set the threshold, and that was just examples of one that's local and of course by statute and law. But I hope that it gets you thinking about the importance of setting those thresholds and be ambitious, but don't be unrealistic as well, right? You can set those thresholds based on research, based on previous experience, based on a landscape scan. Maybe you interview partners and saying, hey, in your program, I see you're doing the same thing as me. What's your threshold for identifying change outcomes for how you measure your progress and accountability? So use your peer network, because I know that you guys are well connected to similar organizations, you're collaborating. So see how your peers are measuring their progress and thinking about those thresholds. Ultimately, I will say funders are pretty apprised and expert at seeing, well, this is a pretty low minimum threshold, or this is a healthy threshold. So for example, one of those could be college completion rates. A minimum threshold in CPS is 41 to 45% are graduating CPS, right? So if you want to really show impact, maybe you want to double that in your program. We say, you know what, we're going to be twice the CPS average and college completion and shoot for 85% or 80%. That's a bold threshold, right? Because you're saying you're twice CPS's average that we're going to graduate our students through college in 6 years. Just as another example locally here in Chicago. So here's an example of a theory of change. So we just walked through the different components. So the long-term outcomes, you always start here. Then you go to the how you did it. And then the what. So what do we do? You work with children, you work in schools, and you work with parents. How do we do it? These are your strategies. You promote engagement between schools and parents. You find practical solutions to educator barriers, and you develop relationships with personal resources. And then what's your outcomes? This is like potentially the early one, right? Like this could be, I think this is how they outlined it as their short term. Well, we improve attendance and participation at school. What does that lead to ultimately? Improved well-being for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. You also improve parental engagement. What does that ultimately lead to? Improved attainment of children from disadvantaged backgrounds. You improve character and resilience. What does that lead to? You improve the life chances. So I'm sure that this organization has documented their assumptions of why they think that if they focus on this, it'll lead to this, and if they do this, it'll lead to that, right? So they've probably already documented their assumptions, pressure tested those assumptions, and ultimately a theory of change is also that higher level view that is a little bit more public, and then the logic model gets super in the weeds of identifying all of those. So just for the interest of time, maybe I won't go through the video, but I do recommend that you watch it offline since you'll have the PowerPoint, because I do want to walk through the logic model components if that's okay. But I think this video nicely summarizes the theory of change conversations. So ultimately, I want you guys to understand the key differences between how logic models and theories of change differ, and how they progress from one step to the next. So logic models are linear, progressing step by step, typically from inputs to activities to outcomes. An effect, an effect never precedes a cause. In a theory of change, however, components are not always potentially linear and can often later influence causes, right? So the main distinction between that logic model and theory of change is that that logic model is so sequential in showing what that intervention's intended outcomes are. So if we provide X, the result will be Y. While a theory of change includes a casual way to show each intervention component and its expected result in an intended outcome. If we provide X, A, we will support or hinder results of Y. So like kind of like what we just showed. And the logic models ideally include a section of contextual factors and assumptions. These are not often detailed in each part of the model, and they're often left out altogether. And the theory of change includes these factors where appropriate throughout the models, and such a logic model is descriptive. The logic model is a descriptive, while a theory of change is more explanatory. And I'm going to walk through a few more examples. So one primary difference between the two is that a logic model describes what you expect to happen, but does not address the why it will happen. The purpose of the theory of change is that it works to identify why your activities and interventions will create the outcome it will. Kind of what we just saw in the previous example, right? And a logic model, on the other hand, will state the outcome that you expect to occur, but not necessarily why you expect that to occur. And as a result of this difference, we can see that a theory of change makes much bigger strides in trying to establish the underlying causes of that change and supports us in making that explicit what we believe to be those causal pathways that we just talked about, right? Like in very much detail. What are the causal pathways between short-term, midterm, and long-term? And then a theory of change works to understand the context in which programs operate. It recognizes that factors outside the program will often have influence as a result. So we just talked about that, right? The external factors that we talked about as an example with Dawn. So it often talks about those. And then a logic model, on the other hand, focuses much more on the program itself and how it is operating rather than those external factors. So like it's really internal focused on the operations of the program. And then a logic model is often created after the program has been developed, working toward from resources through activities to the end result. And the theory of change is the best created before the intervention starts, mapping backwards from the end result in mind to identify the most appropriate solution. So it's often like just the conceptual version of like what we think will happen if potentially you're thinking about launching something new or you're developing a new strategy, when the logic model is like precisely thinking about, okay, now that we have the higher level view, let's get into the weeds. So think about the theory of change being high level and the logic model being in the weeds. So which one should we use? Some considerations to think about are times and resource. A theory of change is due to its intentional complexity, often requires more time and resources to get established, or the logic model actually. So it could be either or. Think about the nature of the intervention. A theory of change is designed to capture the complexities of those relationships that we just talked about. But if you're operating in an environment where there's a lot of factors, both internal and external, to creating the change that you would like to see, a theory of change might be more appropriate because it's higher level view to document those external forces. And if you want a more linear and logical sequential way, you might want to lend a logic model if you're trying to really focus on the logical sequence of your programming. The stage development of theory of change works best when it's developed before the intervention has been put in place or when it's in the early stages of the development. As I mentioned, due to the process of backward mapping, identifying the end result you want to see first and then moving backward from there, the theory of change works best. So you can then scope out to identify your interventions and your activities for your logic model. So it's a nice place to start logically before your logic model, pun intended. And then the importance and intervention. The theory of change helps generate and capture the depth of understanding which isn't present in the logic model, right? So it's worth your time to develop one for interventions of the program or interventions or the programs, which are of great importance to the organizations. And then I'm going to speed up pretty fast because we have a few minutes, but here are the critical components of the logic model that you want to include that are a little bit different than your theory of change, because again, it's so in the weeds about your program. It's more internal. So as long as you have these, you'll be well covered. So as long as you have inputs and resources to the program, activities, interventions, outputs, short-term, intermediate, and long-term goals. And then if you want to include is those external factors that may influence the program success. If you've already included that in theory of change, it could be a good way to also document that. So this is kind of another very specific breakdown. And this is adapted from the UW extension, but I love this example because it breaks down everything that I just outlined. So here you go from your long-term, and you always backward map, remember that. You go from long-term to intermediate, short-term. You focus on outputs. What do we create? What do we do? Who do we reach? Inputs. And then your assumptions are here that we just outlined. And then your external factors. And here will be your indicators for success, right? That you want to include. And then if we had more time, I would walk you through more examples in a really neat video. So that's hyperlinked for your review. But I do want to leave you with 3 key takeaways. So both of these tools provide a powerful framework. They're valuable tools that offer systemic approaches to program planning, implementation, evaluation, the connections between their activities and desired outcomes, and they help you articulate your goals, strategies, and resources needed to achieve your mission. And then alignment between them is critical for effective programming and program success. When these components are properly aligned, organizations can ensure that their interventions, outputs, and outcomes are well connected. You've documented your assumptions, you've outlined your thresholds, your indicators. So your program design is logical and coherent and impactful. And ultimately, they facilitate effective decision-making, resource allocation, evaluation, and ultimately increasing the likelihood of achieving those desired impacts. As Adrian mentioned, you pressure test, am I having the right impact? Well, by you creating those indicators, you understand what you say is the best minimum threshold to set for assessing whether or not you're having the right impact. And you, by you assessing your assumptions of, if we do this, it'll lead to Y, then you understand, am I making the right assumptions, right? You pressure test your assumptions, and maybe you change your assumptions to then have stronger outcomes. And then ultimately, it's a practical tool that leads to meaningful impact. You've seen a few of these examples and case studies, and by applying these real world scenarios, you can more effectively plan, implement, and evaluate your programs, leading to more informed decision-making, improved program effectiveness, and hopefully ultimate greater social impact. So I know I went through that pretty fast, and it's a lot to cover in an hour, but I hope that at least it provided you an introduction to the core components of the logic model, and you feel empowered and inspired to refresh your logic model and theory of change, or to create it for the first time. So please be in touch. If you guys want to see more examples, I'm happy to share more examples with you all for specifically the logic model that we didn't get to cover and we covered rapidly. So feel free to reach out, email me if you have any questions. And of course, this recording will be shared with you all. So please reach out if you'd like to review the recording. And of course, reach out if you want the PowerPoint. So let me drop my email here before I hop off. And please do be in touch. I wish you luck in your evaluation and your program planning. And thank you for being here.